About 20 years ago, I noticed a trend, which is that churches tend to speak in three different voices. When churches speak, or when Christians talk, there are three different ways I've noticed that tend to be the primary ways or the voices that the churches use to speak historically and contemporarily. And I've labeled those three for our conversation today: messianic, therapeutic, and prophetic. Those are sort of three voices that the church uses to bring the message of God to the world. I want to walk you through some unique aspects of these because I think they're illuminating when you get behind them and say what's going on in them. So we're going to start with the messianic. The church speaks in some sense about hope from beyond. And often when the church sounds like this or is using this voice, it almost sounds like the expectation is that God's going to intervene in a situation or in church history. That there is, or in human history, I should say, there is an interventionist component to this messianic expectation. And the goal of this voice, embedded in it, is the hope for salvation or deliverance. That when the church is speaking in this voice, the messianic, it is a cry for hope from beyond, and that the goal is to be saved from our present situation or delivered from the thing that's harming us. And so there's a messianic component to that. But sometimes the church also speaks in a voice that's more therapeutic. It's to help us be the best version of ourselves given our current circumstances. The goal is to help us be sort of well-adjusted, healthy people who are healthy and helpful participants in the culture, even if it's broken. And so there's a therapeutic element that the church speaks in. If you were in the beginning of this service, the entire front half of the service was therapeutic. The video that I showed about the slow work of God, our call to worship is about how we're weary and we need to be healed up. The opening song was, "Lord, I Need You." The opening prayer was about comfort, right? And even the poem that we read was a prayer of hope for healing and for equity. And so the church is very comfortable speaking in this therapeutic voice. It's, for many churches like ours, it's our strongest, most well-practiced voice that we speak in, is the therapeutic. And then a third way that the church speaks is in the prophetic. There is a strong prophetic tradition in Christian churches that actually is inherited from the Jewish tradition from which we come. And this prophetic tradition is well known for doing things like speaking truth to power. That's sort of one of the main functions. Churches that, when they're speaking in this prophetic voice, often participate in protest or organizing for change. I should mention that this voice that the church speaks in is not a conservative voice. It's not trying to preserve the way things are or conserve the way that things have been. This is a voice of change and expectation. So once I noticed these three voices and I started interacting with people from different traditions, I noticed that some churches are more comfortable, some congregations and some denominations are more comfortable speaking in one of the voices than the other. And it's funny because if you visit a lot of churches like I do, one of the things you'll notice is that there are certain kinds of Bible verses. Like if a church is going to have a Bible verse on its front sign or over its door or big in the lobby on the wall, there are certain kind of verses that churches, you can sort of tell what voice that they're most comfortable speaking in by the types of Bible verses that they choose. For instance, messianic churches, because they're looking for hope from beyond or an intervention from this divine God that they proclaim, they're fond of verses like 2 Chronicles 7:14 that says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and seek my face, I will heal their land. Verses like that. Or like Jeremiah 32:38 that says, I will be their God and they will be my people, which is also quoted in the New Testament in 2 Corinthians. But there's a certain kind of Bible verse that they're fond of, which is that there is a God, you're not God, and we need to cry out and expect that God to help us, right? So there's a very messianic component there. Therapeutic churches, I've noticed, are very fond of Micah 6:8. Does anybody know Micah 6:8 by heart? Anybody? Karen, you got it? Do you want to say it? Yes. Yes, good job. So churches that are most comfortable in a therapeutic, they're big fans of passages like Micah 6:8. I'm very impressed, by the way. And then churches that are more in the prophetic tradition, they're fond of passages like Amos 5:24. Let justice roll down like a mighty river, right? And so this expectation that justice is coming, and the heart cry for that change to be made in the world. So as I have journeyed with this idea over the last 15, 20 years, I've noticed a second interesting trend that I wanted to tell you about because I think it's very informative. I have noticed that churches that are primarily messianic in focus, their secondary sort of thing that fuels them is that they also have a heavy therapeutic component. But that in a distant third is the comfort with dealing in the prophetic. And this is actually true for all three kinds of churches that I'm going to mention. It's an irony that in every one of these kinds of churches that I have been watching, there seems to be a primary focus that gets the lion's share of attention. There's a secondary fuel that really gives that punch. And then there's a neglected or a distant third that sort of gets ignored or neglected if we're not careful. So for messianic churches that really believe in a God who's going to come and help us or deliver us or save us, often there's a heavy therapeutic component that helps us to be the best versions of ourselves now and to help us have comfort in our present state. Neglected is the prophetic, intervening in society to make changes towards an eye of justice. That just happens to be a trend I've noticed. I've also noticed since becoming United Methodist that churches that speak primarily in a therapeutic voice, helping you be the best version of yourself or to find comfort in your present circumstances, often have a secondary heart, a real passion for the prophetic. They are very active politically and socially, whether it's feeding people or organizing protests or whatever it is. Churches that are, and I would put, I'm not saying us, but churches like us, that are very therapeutic on Sundays, often during the week participate in the prophetic, trying to make changes to society to help those who are marginalized or disadvantaged. But what I've noticed is that often the neglected third, the least comfortable voice, is of the messianic. So we do the therapeutic well. May the Lord bless and keep you, right? We do the therapeutic well. And we do the prophetic well in social work and active change. But some of us, we're not really sure why we pray, or we don't know if there is a God, what should we expect that God to do to bring about change in the world? And so the messianic gets left out a little bit sometimes in therapeutic churches. And then I've also noticed as I've begun interacting with prophetic churches more, by the way, many white Christians were not aware that there was such a thing as the prophetic tradition until 2007 when Barack Obama, running for president, his pastor made national headlines for being one of the strangest, many of us thought, kind of preachers they'd ever heard, and said things like, God bless America. No, God damn America. And we thought, what kind of a preacher is this? That's when many people became aware that there even was a prophetic tradition in Christian churches. But I've noticed that prophetic churches, and whether they are from the black prophetic tradition or often from what's called the peace tradition, whether that's Mennonite, Anabaptist, Brethren, they're part of the peace tradition, and they protest war, and they are abstainers from the dirtiness of this world, in a sense. They're part of the prophetic tradition as well. That they often, as that is their primary focus, a strong secondary fuel for them is a messianic expectation that there is a God and that God is working on behalf of the marginalized and the poor. That if you want to find God at work, go to the margins. Don't stay at the center. Go to where God is. So churches that are heavily prophetic are often also messianic. But I have learned by listening that a neglected or often distant third element is the therapeutic, which is why those who are socially active and politically committed often are worn out and beat down and weary, is because of the distant third of the therapeutic. So in this series, we've talked about ways that God speaks to us in the 21st century. But today, I wanted to tell you about ways we speak for God in the world, and just point out that it seems to me that there are sort of three distinct, not quite categories, but themes that you can notice if you watch religious broadcasting or if on your social media feed, depending on what you subscribe to, or if you visit different churches like I get a chance to do from time to time, you will definitely notice that there are churches who their primary focus is the messianic, that there is a God and that hope comes from beyond. They often have a therapeutic component, and they may neglect an element of the prophetic, actually organizing and protesting for change in our society. Then you'll go to other churches that feel very therapeutic, helping us be the best versions of ourselves. And during the week, they'll often work in the prophetic to make changes on behalf of those less privileged. But they may have what I call liberal laryngitis when it comes to the messianic, and you say to them, where is God in all of this? And they say, that's a great question. Therapeutics churches love to say, that's a great question. We love the questions. We're not always that sure about the answer. And then there are prophetic churches that often have a messianic expectation. That's where their hope comes from. But if we're not careful, the distant third is the therapeutic, and people are weary and worn out and beat up because they're fighting on behalf of those who they have a heart for. So the question whenever I present this idea, the question that is always asked is, but can't you be all three? And I want to say, wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be fantastic if we were well practiced in all three of these voices? So I want to ask you the question. Twin Falls First United Methodist Church, what would it take for us as a people to speak in all three of these in equal measure? What would it look like for us to be a messianic congregation and to proclaim a God who works in the world? What would we have to do behind the scenes to practice speaking in that voice? Secondly, what would it look like for us to really double down on speaking in the therapeutic, to help soothe people where they have been wounded, to heal them up from life's journeys and battles, and to help them be the best versions of themselves that they can be? What would we have to do behind the scenes to be a house of healing? And then the third, what would have to change around here for us to begin to speak prophetically, to say, the way this isn't the way God wants it, and it's not the way we're going to take it. This has to change, and we're willing to do what it takes to make it happen. What would it look like for a church to be equally practiced speaking in all three of these voices, to have a messianic expectation that hope is beyond and is coming, a therapeutic component to help heal people up and for them to live their best lives, and a prophetic voice that speaks truth to power and says, this isn't okay.